and we go to the UK, and we will have a couple of interventions here. But let's start off with Louise Ball. You are from DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And there's been a lot going on recently in the UK, so you will give us a quick summary, I think.
Yes, thanks ever so much for the invitation to speak, because it's great timing for us, because we've just published a government response to our consultation on the regulation of organisms produced by genetic technologies. So the consultation took place earlier this year. It had two main parts to it. I think the first part is the thing you're most interested in, and it's about changing the definition of GMO as it appears in English law. So I need to be clear here that it's a devolved issue. GM is a devolved issue in the UK. So in the different nations, we have different policies and regulations. So this is for England. And the language here is because of the language in our existing legislation, but it really aligns to the Cartagena Protocol. So when we're talking about organisms using genetic technologies would not be classed as GMOs if their genetic changes could have been produced by traditional methods. It's kind of aligned to the Cartagena Protocol. Could have been produced by traditional methods is aligning us to the sort of notion of new combinations of genetic material. But I'd also really much like to highlight that we are looking at reforming the whole of our GM regulatory framework. It's definitely something we need to consider, especially because our Prime Minister, in his inaugural speech when he took office, talked about liberating our bioscience sector from so-called anti-scientific GM rules. So that's very much a longer term ambition for us. So I'm not going to go through this slide because I don't have time. It sets out the results of the public consultation that we had. But I'd like to, I guess, make one point. We're very aware that most people don't really have an understanding of genetic technologies, gene editing. So it's something we're very much aware that we need to talk to people more about and get involved as much as possible in a public dialogue. And also we're going to be talking in much more detail to targeted stakeholders in the bottom paragraph. It sort of signals some of the issues that came up, which I suspect most people are familiar with. So finally, this is what our last paragraph effectively of our government response says, and it is talking again about this stepwise process that we're going to move through. We've got the two broad ambitions, first of all our step one, and then this longer term ambition in step two. So the first thing we'll be doing is bringing in secondary legislation to make field trials less burdensome. So there'll be a notification process rather than authorization, and no 9-figure grid reference, which 6-figure grid references, which is what we're requiring at the moment. And we're hoping to do that by the end of this year. The second step is, as I said, about changing the definition. So that's something we're very much looking into. It isn't entirely new territory for us. Again, that's why I guess we're starting with this. I think some of you will be aware that before the European Court of Justice ruled, we did have a couple of occasions where companies, organisations came to us for a view on whether we thought things were GM or not, and we said they weren't. So we'd already used our advisory committee and a scientific process to get to this point, and it's also aligned with our intervention to the EU Court of Justice ruling. So it's not entirely new territory for us, but we are doing a lot now. I think as the discussion has influenced, there's lots of issues and we need to make sure this lands properly and we do it properly. And the other areas that we need to look at, there are other measures, not just GM measures, that will affect whether gene edited products and the products of other technologies can get onto the market. So we very much need to look at those two. And then, as I said, the next big step will be to look at longer term reform. And I think Joyce is probably going to pick up on that more than me. So hopefully I've achieved that in 5 minutes, and I'll hand over to Joyce to talk
Thanks very much. I will take questions of clarification after Joyce Tate speaks, but Professor Joyce Tate from Edinburgh, and you were engaged in the report of the Regulatory Horizons Commission. So I hope you are with us.
Yes, I am. Yes, thank you.
Excellent news.
I don't see my slides yet.
Okay. Hoopla. Ah, great. Okay, we can see the slides.
Please, Dr. Joyce.
Okay, so I've clicked on Take Control.
Perfect.
And I should just mention that I'm a member of the Regulatory Horizons Council, and 3 members of that council were responsible for this report, myself, Matt Ridley and Andy Greenfield. And we're all got quite a lot of regulatory experience, some of us more in depth than others as far as genetic technologies are concerned. And we, if you look at the remit of the Regulatory Horizons Council, this is an independent expert committee supported by civil servants, and we're under the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, so not directly responsive to DEFRA, but we've been having close discussions and interactions with DEFRA throughout this. We're part of a commitment from the UK government's white paper on regulation for the 4th Industrial Revolution to put the UK regulatory system as a whole onto a new, more innovation-friendly thing than it has been in the past, given that we're now no longer completely bound by the European regulatory approach. So the remit that we're talking about here, we were asked by the UK government to devise ways to regulate genetic technologies in agriculture in future so as to encourage safe and beneficial innovation. And it was related to our departure from the European Union, but also with the understanding that we do still have to trade with other nations in the world, and so we will have to have a regulatory system that is generally compliant with the standards that are in place elsewhere. But there is, you probably understand that the UK government has an ambition to become a leader in regulatory innovation, as well as just making individual regulatory decisions across the board. So this is part of an overall government agenda. And this slide is describing how we framed future genetic technologies for our study on the governance of innovative genetic technologies. And we conducted a background analysis that noted the lack of demonstrated hazards for the many products of straightforward genetic technologies that have been in place for 20 years. And beyond that, we have second generation genetic technologies such as genome editing, synthetic biology and engineering biology, which have the potential to transform agri-food systems, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and contribute to climate resilience, sustainability, and biodiversity conservation. So we're talking here about the new genetic technologies, how they can usefully be regulated, and simple genome editing is one approach, but the more complex genome technologies like synthetic biology and engineering biology will also be extremely important in future and need to be taken into account. So we took a relatively open remit and decided to look beyond simple gene editing, SND1 and SND2, and look at what would be needed to give all genetic technologies a more science-based and pro-innovation route to market in other countries, focusing particularly on a product-based approach and what it might look like. So this is a longer-term objective of our study, which was to look at how we could propose a regulatory system that would work, that would be product-based, with minimum reliance on arguments about processes and what processes were regulated by which instrument and so on. So it's relevant to gene editing, and what we're saying is we must be careful that while we're doing the current regulatory adaptation to meet the needs of simple gene editing technologies, we don't actually introduce something into the regulatory systems which will make it much more difficult in future to regulate these other much more powerful genetic techniques like synthetic biology that involve trans-species genetic transfer. So our proposed regulatory approach, that there's a link to the website for the report itself on the first slide, and you will be able to read this if you take a look at the report on the web. But our proposal is process-based for the very first regulatory decision, which is looking at whether the genetic modification that has taken place, if something comes under the definition of the Cartagena Protocol definition of an LMO, then it will be looked at by the regulator initially to decide whether there is any grounds, scientific grounds, to expect any risks arising from that process in the product. And beyond that point, it's regulated by what we call the sectoral regulatory system for the kind of product that it is. So if it's a novel food or a novel animal feed, it goes straight to the regulatory system for that type of product. And there is no additional consideration if there are no risks identified. There's no additional consideration of its role as a genetically modified or gene edited or synthetic biology based organism. So our proposal is slightly different. I think we tried to be as inventive and innovative as we could. We took account of all the other regulatory systems that we were studying throughout the world. We tried to do something that went beyond what most other people are doing. I hope we've come up with something that is that takes things forward in a productive and helpful way, but also that allows the UK to develop its current approach to gene editing as is being proposed by DEFRA, and allowing us to make quick wins in that area following what's happening in the rest of the world. So I'd be very interested to discuss this with anybody either now or be outside this meeting if anybody is interested to look at our proposals and discuss them with us and help advise us on what needs to be done in future in this area. Thank you very much.